Did you know that anesthesiologists were initially resistant to the implementation of pulse oximetry for surgical patients? I know it seems categorically insane, like a plot straight out of American Horror Story, but sadly it's very true, and it wasn't that long ago. If you grew up reading these books, then there is a high likelihood that when you were born, either you nor your mom were monitored with pulse oximetry. And to think of that now is it's definitely more terrifying than anything Alvin Schwartz ever wrote. Every shift, we put a pulse oximeter on our patient's finger. It's routine, it's mundane, it's a checkbox on our pre-induction checklist, but this device, this sortilege that reveals the invisible oxygen in somebody's blood is only slightly older than me, and the story of how it went from a laboratory curiosity to the standard of care reveals something darker about medicine that we did unfortunately already know, and that is dismissing sensible solutions based on things like principle, ego, and overall resistance to change. Before 1980, anesthesiologists monitored oxygenation through observation. They watched for things like cyanosis and that telltale blue pallor hypoxic tissue look, but research demonstrated what clinical intuition should have suspected, and that was 25% of trained observers failed to detect oxygen saturation below 75%, and that's below the threshold where brain damage begins. They could perform things like ABG analysis, but the needle stick was painful to patients that were awake, and the results took 30 minutes. Brain death occurs in 5. So they watched faces, they listened to breath sounds, and they hoped. And during that time, between 2,000 and 10,000 patient deaths could be attributed annually to hypoxemia. Now, oximetry itself, with the red and infrared light that's been kicked around the engineering community since the 1930s, it was really shitty back then. Unreliable oximetry devices hit the market in the 40s, but no one was really using them. But except for 1947, they unequivocally knew, though, that 25% of trained professionals could not detect cyanosis, and it wasn't until 1972 that a Japanese engineer named Takuo Ayogai, he discovered pulse oximetry accidentally. He was measuring cardiac output in his lab, and he was frustrated by the pulsations causing artifact, and then it dawned on him that the artifact, or the interference, was the thing that needed to be measured. Since only arterial blood pulsates, the ratio of pulsatile to non-pulsatile light absorption at 2 different wavelengths, red at 660 nanometers and infrared at 940 nanometers, could isolate the arterial oxygen saturation signal. This effectively eliminated the complex calibration that had plagued earlier oximeters, and he did file a patent in 1974, but his company that he worked for, called Nyon Coden, only sold 200 units. They didn't file an international patent. And for some reason, Ayogai, he was transferred to a desk job, so the technology that could have saved thousands of lives sat unused. That is, until 1979, when a company in Boulder, Colorado called Biox Technology decided to replace the incandescent bulbs with stable LEDs and microprocessors. And then they released the Biox 2 in 1981, and the first commercially successful pulse oximeter was now available. But even with working technology, medicine demanded impossible evidence, and you can't really ethically run a trial where you deliberately withhold a life-saving monitor for half of your patients. So the profession waited for proof that can never be generated while patients continued to die.
Good evening, I'm Hugh Downs, and this is 2020.
It took the April 1982 ABC 2020 broadcast called The Deep Sleep, 6,000 Patients Will Die or Suffer from Brain Damage to put the spotlight on anesthesia deaths. And even with the public breathing fire on anesthesiologists to do better, they were still resistant, until a retrospective analysis revealed that 88% of malpractice insurance payouts could have been prevented had they just used better monitoring standards like pulse oximetry. Probably one of the few times that insurance has rallied in our favor. But anyway, in 1985, the Harvard Department of Anesthesia, in the most Harvard way possible, basically said, listen here, fuckers, you need to use this technology. These were now the standards, not just guidelines, meaning any deviation would constitute automatic malpractice liability. But it wasn't until January of 1990 that pulse oximetry became the ASA standard of care. And you guys, 1990. And as a result, malpractice claims dropped. Mortality rates dropped 10 to 40-fold, and capnography came on the scene as a standard in 1991. So when I said, if you grew up reading Alvin Schwartz, little did you know that you were actually living in a true American horror story. And speaking of other weird parallels. The Japanese engineer, Mr. Ayugai, the icon, the legend, he serendipitously passed away in April of 2020, right when pulse oximetry became a household item during the pandemic, and quite possibly one of the most critical diagnostic and monitoring tools of that time. The magic of pulse oximetry is so real, yet the tragedy is how long we refuse to believe it.